They cut off my water. Not by accident, but with a brand new lock stamped with the HA's initials. My crops were dying, my animals were crying out in thirst, and they did it with a smile. I'm a retired Army captain and former federal water inspector, and I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a violation. This was a declaration of war. And they had no idea who they were starting a fight with. I set the bucket down and walked toward the spigot by the barn. The troughs were bone dry. The tap produced nothing but the hollow, mocking groan of air. My mind tried to stay calm, logical. Maybe a pipe froze even though it was early spring and the temperatures hadn't dipped below 50 all week. Maybe it was a pressure issue. Maybe one of the kids in the HOA thought it'd be funny to mess with the water valves. But none of those thoughts lasted long. I marched down to the edge of my property where the old municipal water box sat half hidden by overgrowth and a few stubborn tufts of clover. That's when I saw it. A brand new lock, bright silver, clean as factory steel, dangling from the valve like a smug grin. It wasn't there yesterday. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. I crouched down and touched the lock. Heavy-duty, tamper-proof, stamped with the HOA's initials. I stood up and just stared at it. I'd lived on this land for 22 years. Bought it after leaving the service. 3 years in Afghanistan, 2 in Kuwait, and one too many nights wondering if I'd ever get back to something real. When I came home, I didn't want anything fancy. Just room to grow things, raise animals, and be left the hell alone. And for 2 decades, that's exactly what I had until the HOA expanded. Their development, Clearview Meadows, used to be a good half-mile away. New homes, bright fences, artificial lawns, rolled out like green plastic carpets. I wasn't their kind of neighbor, and they weren't mine. But then the county redrew the boundary lines, annexing my side of the road into their jurisdiction without any of us older residents being consulted. Next thing I knew, I was technically part of Clearview Phase 3. With it came rules, restrictions, petty complaints, noise warnings when my rooster crowed before sunrise, threats about the smell of livestock, but locking off my water, that was new. That was war. I took a deep breath, trying to keep the soldier in me tucked beneath the surface. You learn after enough time in command that rage doesn't win battles. Patience does. I turned around, walked back toward the barn, and made a call. The water company gave me a script. Sir, the property now falls under HOA jurisdiction for secondary service lines. The Homeowners Association has requested control of shared valves for all connected lots. What about agricultural use? I asked. If you are zoned residential per HOA charter, agriculture falls under non-essential discretionary use. That's the wording I was given. I wanted to throw the phone instead. I thanked the woman for her time and hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from a memory. It had been decades, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I walked to a locked cabinet I hadn't opened since I came home from the war. That evening, the cows lowed louder than usual. The goats paced the fence. I drained what I could from the backup barrels, but I knew it wouldn't last more than 2 days. I drove out past the tree line and used the old pump to draw from the stream at the far edge of the property, but the runoff was weak this time of year, and hauling barrels up the slope wasn't sustainable. Every part of me wanted to drive to the HOA office and start shouting, but I knew better. I dealt with petty tyrants in desert towns who hid behind uniforms and titles. HOA boards weren't that different. Instead, I opened my storage locker and pulled up the first of many binders I hadn't touched in years. My inspection logs, my deployment records, my water systems certification. Most people didn't know I'd worked for the Department of Water Resources before enlisting. Fewer still knew I'd helped write parts of the compliance training the EPA still used for municipal cross-connection control. I hadn't needed those credentials in decades. But now looking at that smug little lock, I realized it was time to remember who I was before I was just the old guy with goats. By the next morning, the garden was already wilting. The tomato vines curled like dying fingers. I watched a bee hover over a withered squash blossom and fly away unsatisfied. This land had given me peace, solace, identity. I wasn't about to let a bunch of vinyl fence tyrants strangle it to death. And as I sat beneath the old elm, scribbling notes in a fresh legal pad, I knew one thing for sure. If they thought I was going to play by the rules, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning I shaved. Not a trim. A full clean shave, the kind I hadn't bothered with in months. I put on a collared shirt, light blue with faint stripes, and my old leather belt that still bore the mark of my officer's badge long since retired. I wanted to look like what I used to be, someone who didn't get pushed around. I knew where the HOA office was. They'd converted one of the model homes at the entrance of the subdivision into their community operations center, which was really just a fancy name for a trailer with stucco. Still, it had air conditioning, tinted windows, and a flagpole out front waving the Clearview Meadows banner just as high as the American one. That told me everything I needed to know about the people inside. When I arrived, the parking lot was mostly empty. It was just before 9 a.m. I walked up to the door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, a petite woman in a peach blouse and oversized sunglasses opened it. She looked me up and down like I was tracking mud across a museum floor. "Can I help you?" "Yes, I'm here to speak with the HOA president," I said. She blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, smiling. "But I have a dry farm and a locked water valve, so I figured we should talk." Her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't invite me in. "Wait here." I could hear murmurs through the door, the sound of papers shuffling and a faint curse. Then a voice I recognized from a single town hall meeting. "Fine, send him in." I stepped into a space that tried desperately to look official. Cheap laminate desks, fake plants, and framed photos of Clearview homes under pastel skies. Behind the desk, sipping from a mug that said Boss Lady, sat Karen Mitchell. She looked exactly like you'd expect an HOA Karen to look. Perfectly ironed blouse, pearl earrings, and a hairstyle that hadn't changed since Clinton was in office. But her eyes weren't soft. They were cold, calculating. "Mister," she began, pretending not to remember. "James Callahan," I said. "You know who I am." "Yes," she replied, setting down her mug. "I believe we've corresponded. Your property was incorporated into Clearview Phase 3 last year. As such, you're subject to association rules and resource allocation standards." I raised an eyebrow. "Resource allocation? Is that what you call cutting off water to livestock?" She smiled. Fake, polished. "The HOA has the right to restrict discretionary water usage during periods of high consumption. Our residential homes take precedence. I'm sure you understand." "No, I don't understand," I said flatly. "That valve services my land and there's no drought. This isn't about conservation. This is about control." Her smile didn't waver. "Your property is zoned residential under the new charter. Agricultural usage is considered excessive, especially since you're the only one using that quantity of water outside of lawn maintenance." "It's a farm," I said. "I have animals, crops, and a lawn," she shot back, tapping a file on her desk. "According to our inspection notes, your grass exceeds allowable height in the south paddock. That alone is a violation." I stared at her. She was enjoying this. "You're overstepping," I said, my voice low. "You don't own the water. You don't own my land. And you sure as hell don't have the right to sabotage my livelihood." Karen leaned back in her chair. "Actually, we do. You signed the easement documents when the annexation occurred." "I didn't sign anything," I said. "Well," she said, tilting her head. "Someone did. Legally, the HOA has stewardship over shared infrastructure that includes water access points." My gut twisted. She wasn't bluffing. Not completely. The county might have handed them those rights without telling me, buried in some line of fine print tied to the new zoning map I never agreed to. "You think you can just push me out?" I asked. She stood, walking around the desk slowly like a cat with a limp mouse. "Mr. Callahan, no one's pushing you out. But if you can adapt to community standards, perhaps you'd be happier elsewhere." The word elsewhere echoed in my ears. That was the goal all along. Make life so unbearable I'd leave on my own. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "Then you'll need to get very comfortable with our rules." I left without another word. As I stepped outside, I caught sight of a young landscaper dragging a hose across the lawn in front of the HOA office. The sprinklers were running full blast on the subdivision flower beds. Hydrangeas getting a royal soak while my cows went thirsty. The injustice of it boiled in my stomach. But watching those sprinklers drown flowers while my animals suffered, That was the moment my anger turned to ice. Karen wanted to play bureaucrat, but I was about to introduce her to a whole new set of rules. By the time I got home, the goats had kicked over the empty troughs. The cattle were pacing. I checked the garden again. More wilted stems, dead soil. I spent the rest of the afternoon hauling water by hand from the stream, filling up containers and barrels, trying to keep the animals alive. That night, I pulled every document I had, land surveys, water rights, old letters from the county. I found nothing useful, but I wasn't done yet. I walked into my garage, opened a locked cabinet I hadn't touched in years, and pulled out a folder thick with federal manuals, enforcement case studies, and a well-worn EPA badge with my name on it. Karen wanted a war. She just picked the wrong veteran. The third day without steady water hit harder than the others. Not just physically, though my arms ached from hauling barrels up the incline behind the barn, but emotionally. I stood at the edge of the east field, watching my crops wither into brittle ghosts of themselves. The spinach had yellowed, the tomatoes drooped like they were bowing out of a fight, and the peppers had stopped blooming entirely. Every row of soil I'd once nurtured looked sunburnt and starved. This farm wasn't just where I lived. It was my sanctuary, a place I came to recover from war, from bureaucracy, from the noise of the world. I'd poured my soul into this land, and now it was choking. And so were my animals. I walked to the goat pen and found Ruthie, my oldest doe, lying down in the corner with her head pressed to the fence. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes dim. A dry water dish sat beside her, still warm from the midday sun. I'd filled it twice already that morning, but it wasn't enough. "Come on, girl," I said softly, crouching beside her. She didn't move. I stroked her head and felt the sharp bones of her skull through the thinning fur. That did something to me. Something primal. That evening, I heard the unmistakable hum of HOA drones circling above my property again. Little quadcopters with cameras sent out under the guise of landscaping assessment. I'd seen them fly over before, but now they lingered, hovered like vultures, waiting for something to die. By nightfall, the garden was gone. I sat on my porch with a flashlight and a legal pad, writing down every loss I could account for so far. 5 tomato rows, 3 pepper beds, for laying hens producing, 1 goat dangerously dehydrated, 30 gallons of emergency water left. And as I wrote, I heard a weak, ragged sound from the pen. It was Ruthie, and I knew she wouldn't make it through the night. Meanwhile, I watched the sprinklers from across the street go off like clockwork, soaking HOA planters filled with ornamental grasses and drought-immune shrubs. It was like living next to a lie, and the lie was growing. The next morning, I discovered a flyer stuffed into my mailbox. No envelope, no postage, just a brightly colored HOA newsletter titled "Protecting Our Water, a Community Effort." It featured photos of lush HOA lawns and smiling board members standing near water fountains. And there on page 2 was a paragraph that sent my blood cold. Due to ongoing misuse of shared resources by certain residents resisting Clearview's transition, HOA leadership has taken necessary measures to safeguard access for compliant homeowners. If you witness unauthorized agricultural watering or gray water usage, please report it to the board. They were painting me as a criminal. I wasn't just cut off. They were laying the groundwork to make it seem justified. I drove to the local hardware store, hoping to find some way to reroute flow from the stream through a makeshift gravity-fed system. It was a long shot, but I had to try. On the way, I stopped at the diner for a coffee refill and noticed 2 HOA residents at the counter whispering behind their hands. One of them pointed at me. "You know that guy's been hoarding water, right?" The woman said, not even bothering to lower her voice after I looked over. The other replied, "Karen says he's trying to sabotage the system." Real selfish. Probably trying to sue the HOA. I clenched my fists. Not because of their words, I'd heard worse in combat zones, but because of the strategy. Karen wasn't just cutting off my water. She was cutting off my credibility. That night, I checked the fencing again. No break-ins, but the padlock on the shared valve was now double-chained. They were afraid I'd tamper with it. And truth be told, I was tempted. Instead, I did what I knew how to do. I documented everything. I filmed the dry troughs, the wilted garden, the goats struggling to stand. I spoke into the camera with measured calm, timestamping every piece of evidence. Day 4, no water, no communication. HOA claims conservation, but ignores actual agricultural needs. My name is James Callahan. This is what abuse of power looks like. Then I packed up the footage and placed it on a flash drive. I had no intention of going quietly. Not this time. The next blow came the following morning. I found Ruthie dead. She had curled herself against the wall of the pen, her body already stiff from the cool night air. I buried her beneath the sycamore tree she used to nap under every spring. And as I covered her with the last scoop of soil, something in me shifted. They weren't just inconveniencing me anymore. They were killing what I loved. It wasn't just about water. It was about control, about domination, about forcing people like me, people who didn't fit into their prefab mold, off the land we built our lives on. Karen could smile all she wanted, hide behind flyers and policy memos, but what she was doing was systematic harassment, and the law had a name for that. I returned to my desk that night, pulled out my old laptop, and began compiling everything into a single dossier: photos, videos, zoning documents, annexation maps, quotes from HOA literature. Then I opened my inbox and typed a name I hadn't written in over a decade. Derek Vaughn, lead counsel at the Office of Surface Water Management, US EPA. Subject line: illegal HOA interference with federal agricultural water rights. Urgent review requested. I attached the first batch of evidence. I hit send. And then I waited. For 2 days, nothing. The garden was dust. The animals were listless. I started to wonder if I'd just shouted into a void. Then, on Thursday, I decided if they weren't coming to me, I'd take the fight to them. The town hall meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 6:30 sharp, though by 5:45 the lot was already packed with SUVs and Subarus neatly parked and gleaming under the sunset like a line of suburban soldiers. I pulled into the dirt patch across the street where trucks like mine still dared to park and killed the engine. For a moment, I sat there in the silence, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in Clearview Meadows. I hadn't attended one of these in nearly a year. The last time I'd been shut down in under 2 minutes for daring to ask why my livestock was being cited for community disruption. I hadn't spoken up since. But tonight was different. Tonight I had evidence and fury and a cause that no one could call petty. Inside the meeting room buzzed with the chirp of pleasantries and the rustle of programs. Residents filed into rows of beige plastic chairs, fanning themselves with HOA newsletters and sipping complimentary water bottles, free-flowing irony, considering my farm was still bone dry. At the front of the room stood the Clearview HOA board, 5 members in matching navy blue polos with the HA emblem stitched over their hearts like badges of honor. Karen Mitchell sat at the center of the table, lips tight, shoulders square as if already preparing for war. I stood in the back at first, letting the minutes tick by as the board ran through their standard agenda: new parking restrictions, updated lawn length guidelines, approval of vendor contracts for holiday lights. No mention of water, not a word. Finally, they opened the floor. A man in khaki stood and asked about pet waste stations. A young mom complained about the community pool's hours. Then Karen cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Mr. Callahan," she said, projecting her voice with that patronizing tone that always made my blood rise. "I understand you've requested to speak this evening. You have 2 minutes." I stepped forward, aware that every eye in the room had turned to me. I didn't bother with a smile. "My name is James Callahan. I own the farm at the southeast end of Clearview Phase 3. And for the past 5 days, my property has been without water due to the HOA's decision to lock the shared valve that feeds my land." Several heads turned. A few people whispered. Karen's smile tightened. "My livestock have suffered. My crops are dead. And one of my goats, Ruthie, died of dehydration yesterday morning." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen raised her hand. "Mr. Callahan, we explained." I didn't let her finish. "You explained nothing. You acted unilaterally. You made decisions about a water source you don't own and cut off access to land that predates your development by over 2 decades. Mr. Callahan, you've broken state water code, I said firmly, pulling a folder from my bag. This is a printout of California's agricultural water protection laws. And this, I held up a USB drive, contains video documentation, photos, maps, and drone footage proving that the HOA has rerouted flow from my property to irrigate your dog park and HOA lawn. Gasps, whispers. Karen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. This isn't just unethical, I said. It's criminal, and I've already submitted a full dossier to the EPA and the Office of Surface Water Management. A few people clapped soft, hesitant, but enough to puncture the room's silence. Karen stood up now, gripping the edge of the table. Mr. Callahan, she said, voice quivering with performative calm. You are making inflammatory accusations that have not been legally reviewed. They will be, I cut in. Federal agents are reviewing them right now. Sir, your property is zoned under Phase 3 and is subject to, my land was annexed without consent, I snapped. And I never signed any binding agreement with your board. You forged that compliance packet and backdated the signature. That's in the report, too. Karen blinked. That did it. From the second row, a woman stood. Wait, what do you mean? They forged his signature. Another voice, an older man near the aisle. You're saying the HOA faked compliance paperwork? Karen raised her voice, struggling now. That's categorically false. No, it's not, I said, turning toward the room. I pulled county records. The version the HOA submitted to the registrar's office lists a signature that doesn't match mine, and it's dated a week before I was even notified of the annexation. A man near the front stood. Can we see that evidence? Karen's face had gone pale. The agents will have it first, I said. But I'll make it available when the investigation concludes. Someone shouted. You can't just cut off a man's water, and suddenly the room shifted. The board fidgeted. Karen tried to speak again, but the murmurs drowned her out. People have kids, a woman said sharply. What if it were our homes next? We trusted you, someone else barked. Karen held up her hands, her voice climbing with desperation. We are operating within our rights. No, Karen, I said quietly. You're operating within your power, not your right. She stared at me like I'd stabbed her. I left before they adjourned. I didn't need to stay. I'd said what I came to say. And judging by the storm I'd left behind, the tide had started to turn. As I stepped out into the night air, a young man I didn't recognize approached me in the parking lot. Hey, he said, hesitant. I'm Marcus. I'm the HOA's landscaping vendor. I saw what happened. Just wanted you to know, you're not the only one who thinks this whole setup's messed up. I nodded. Appreciate that. He looked around, lowered his voice. They've been watering the green belt twice a day. Karen told me not to mention it on invoices. I looked at him. Would you be willing to say that on record? He hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. By Friday morning, I was already in the field with a shovel in my hands. Not for planting, for proof. The night after the town hall, sleep barely touched me. I lay awake replaying the murmurs, the gasps, the moment Karen's composure cracked. But it wasn't enough. Words in a meeting, no matter how powerful, didn't match the weight of hard evidence. I needed something undeniable. And I had a theory. 2 years ago, before the annexation, I helped install a separate utility line to bring in upgraded filtration near the animal shelter on my east border. I still had the blueprints. The HOA's current valve wasn't supposed to affect that line, unless someone had rerouted it. And if someone did, the pipes would show it. So there I was on my knees with dirt in my nails, tracing old PVC runs behind the goat barn, mapping out every foot of buried infrastructure like a man chasing ghosts. I didn't have high-tech gear, just my memory, a few faded diagrams, and my own hands. 3 hours in, I found the first sign. A section of pipe that had once run straight now curved, clumsily, forced at an angle with a new joint that didn't match the original color. Fresh sealant still pliable. That section had been altered recently. Too recently. My heart started to race. Not from the digging, but from realization. They didn't just cut my water. They rerouted it. I kept going, following the curve deeper across the side fence toward the HOA's prized community park. That's when I found it buried under just 4 inches of soil near a manicured hedge line that marked the edge of HOA property, a Y-junction valve. One side fed toward my property, the other toward a buried irrigation main that ran behind the tennis courts. I couldn't believe it. They literally siphoned my water, my supply line, my pressure into their recreational systems. No notice, no legal document, just quiet sabotage. I snapped photos, took measurements, and made a quick sketch. Then I ran a quick test. I opened the cap on my end, watched the trickle. Then I moved to the HOA side and twisted their valve. Water gushed. Clear, cold, under full pressure. They weren't conserving. They were stealing. I drove straight to Marcus's landscaping shed behind the clubhouse. He looked startled when I showed up, but not surprised. They really did it, didn't they? He said, looking over the photos I'd printed. They didn't just install a new valve. They redirected a shared system into their private irrigation, I said. You got access to your last few work orders? He nodded and pulled out a wrinkled clipboard. They started asking me to water the park manually just after the annexation. Said the sprinklers weren't reaching full range anymore. I leaned against the counter, a cold weight settling in my stomach because they were sucking the pressure off my supply. Marcus thumbed through pages, then stopped. Here, this invoice has a note from Karen. She told me to invoice extra hours for hand irrigation due to residential rerouting. I didn't think much of it at the time. I scanned the page. It was dated the same week they locked my valve. There it was in black and white. Back home, I compiled everything. Photos of the unauthorized pipe, the Y-junction, the rerouted flow test, Marcus's signed statement, the annotated invoice. Then I sent it all to Derek Vaughn at the EPA with the subject line, confirmed unauthorized water diversion, federal violation under Section 11,417. Just before midnight, I received a reply. James, this is big. We're opening a case and notifying the State Water Resources Control Board. Expect contact soon. Do not disturb the site. You did good. DV. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling, not with fear, but with relief. They thought I was just some aging farmer, a leftover from a past they were trying to bulldoze with white fences and backyard brunches. But I'd walked the halls of DC. I'd trained state inspectors on water ethics. I knew where the cracks formed, and now I knew how to shine light into them. I slept that night for the first time in nearly a week until sunrise woke me with something new. A knock. When I opened the door, a tall man in a gray utility jacket stood on my porch, badge clipped to his chest. Stephen Holt, California State Water Board. Mr. Callahan, he said, nodding. Mind showing me that pipe system? I did more than that. I walked him through everything with calm precision. I showed him the altered connections, the photos, the invoices, the location maps, even the pressure readings. He didn't say much, just kept nodding, taking notes, and asking quiet questions. After nearly 2 hours, we stood in front of the goat barn again, right back where I started digging. He turned to me. This is textbook unauthorized diversion. I exhaled. What happens now? I asked. He checked his watch. We notify the feds. We contact local code enforcement. And we issue an emergency cease and desist order to the Clearview HOA for all irrigation activity pending a full review. He paused. You should be prepared for retaliation. They won't take this quietly. I gave a half smile. Neither did Ruthie. And she still went down fighting. He looked at me for a long moment, then handed me a copy of the notice they'd be delivering to the HOA that same day. This one's for your records. I took it. The paper was thin, but the weight of it in my hand felt like justice starting to take form. They buried their theft in my soil. Now I was digging it back out. When the knock came again just 2 days after the inspection, it wasn't from a state agent. It was the feds. A black SUV pulled into my driveway just after 8 a.m. No sirens, no flashing lights, just quiet authority. Out stepped 2 people in dark suits. One man tall and broad-shouldered with the calm posture of someone used to staring down congressional hearings. The other a woman with a file case and mirrored glasses she didn't remove. Mr. James Callahan, the man asked. I nodded. That's me, Agent Ruben Cross. This is Agent Dana Morales. We're with the EPA Office of Criminal Enforcement. We received your file. We'd like to walk the property with you. I didn't hesitate. I'd been waiting for this moment since I first touched that dry spigot. We walked the line together. The barn, the garden, the goat pen where Ruthie had died. Agent Morales took photos of everything, moving with methodical care. Ruben asked pointed technical questions about flow rates, infrastructure history, and jurisdictional records. They were impressed. I could tell, not just with what I'd uncovered, but how I'd laid it out. You were in enforcement? Morales finally asked as we examined the Y valve near the park line. State level, then federal before I served. She looked up. Military, Army 2 tours, Water Logistics Officer. Ruben nodded. Figures. Your documentation is better than some of the agency field reports I've seen. I learned early, I said, that in a drought, paperwork moves faster than panic. We walked back toward my house. On the porch, Ruben paused and asked, were you aware that this HOA has received multiple citizen complaints over the last 18 months, some bordering on civil rights violations? My breath caught. No, but it doesn't surprise me. Morales opened the file case. We've also confirmed they filed annexation paperwork under a forged compliance form. Your signature doesn't match the county records from 5 years ago. We ran it through analysis. They admitted that publicly. I said at the town hall. They didn't even try to deny it. Ruben pulled out a formal document with a seal I hadn't seen in years. Preliminary action notification, Clearview Meadows HOA, suspected federal water violation under Title 42, Chapter 6A. Next step, he said, is to notify them of an active federal investigation. Something in my chest loosened, but it wasn't relief. It was purpose. I watched as they got back in their vehicle and drove off toward the heart of Clearview Meadows. Within the hour, I heard the unmistakable sound of panic. 3 HOA board members pacing outside the clubhouse, talking fast and wide-eyed. Karen wasn't among them yet, but I knew she would be. I returned inside, pulled my old binder from under the couch, and flipped open to a page I hadn't read in over a decade. Enforcement Tactics for Water Theft and Municipal Diversion. I knew what would happen next, interviews, audits, depositions, but I also knew how they'd fight. Karen wouldn't collapse right away. People like her always had one more trick, one more desperate press release, one more board meeting filled with half-truths and dramatic tears. She'd try to spin it, paint herself as a victim of government overreach, maybe even claim it was a clerical error. But I wasn't the same man I was when I moved out here. Just a tired veteran looking for peace and tomatoes in the soil. Now I had a mission again, and I wasn't alone. That evening, Marcus came by quietly, dropping off another folder. These are copies of the HOA water invoices from the last 6 months, he said. I kept my own just in case. Karen's been doctoring the ones she submits to the board. Inside were scans with different numbers, altered usage totals, and a note scribbled in Karen's own handwriting. Combined park and east line totals. No breakdown needed. She had covered her tracks, but not all of them. That night I sat by the fire pit out back, laptop open, email blinking. Agent Morales had sent another update. We've frozen HOA irrigation systems for non-residential zones pending review. Recommend you check your line again. Let us know what you find. I dropped my coffee, bolted to the barn, twisted the valve. Water. Clear, cold, rushing with purpose. It was like hearing my land breathe again. The goats scrambled for it. The cows gathered. The garden, wilted though it was, seemed to lean toward the hose like they remembered. I dropped to my knees in the wet grass and let the stream soak my hands, my arms, my sleeves. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a turning point, a pulse, the beginning of something greater than revenge. The next morning, I woke to a silence that didn't feel normal. No goats bleating, no sprinklers hissing across the HOA lawn across the fence. No drone hovering in the distance like a plastic vulture, just the low rustle of wind through the dry corn stalks and the creak of old wood as I stepped onto my porch. Then I saw it. An official white placard taped right to the HOA clubhouse door across the road. Notice of federal investigation. All HOA operations temporarily suspended. They'd done it. The agents had pulled the trigger. It was happening. Karen must have seen it, too, because her car, a shiny white Lexus that looked like it had never touched gravel, was already parked in front, and she was pacing back and forth like a wind-up doll losing tension. She clutched a thick folder to her chest, phone pressed hard to her ear, talking fast and tight-lipped. Her usual calm veneer was gone. What replaced it was the raw panic of someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them until they did. I didn't feel smug. I didn't even feel vindicated. I felt focused because I wasn't finished yet. Inside, I'd already compiled the full dossier, everything: dates, video files, screenshots of the forged signature, drone footage showing the redirected irrigation, interviews, mine, Marcus's. Even one from the widow down the street who hadn't had consistent water pressure for months and thought it was just the pipes aging. I added one more thing that morning: a sworn affidavit. James Callahan, retired U.S. Army captain, former state water enforcement officer. Subject: civilian water access interference and HOA misconduct. I wrote about Ruthie. I wrote about the troughs I filled by hand in the dark while HOA sprinklers ran on timers across dog parks and ornamental shrub rows. I wrote about the silence when I first asked questions, the intimidation, the fake newsletter articles that painted me as unstable and dangerous. And then I clicked send. The email went to the EPA, the State Water Resources Control Board, the County Civil Code Office, and local press. A copy also went to my private server with instructions to forward it to 2 national agricultural rights coalitions if anything suspicious happened to me or my property. Paranoid, maybe, but I've seen what power does when it feels threatened. An hour later, Agent Morales called. "We've escalated," she said. "Your documentation forced the DOJ to open a formal case." My grip on the phone tightened. "You're serious. We'll be seizing records, freezing their accounts. The HOA has been charging residents for infrastructure upgrades, including the water line they redirected from your property. So, they made homeowners pay to fund the theft?" "Yes," she confirmed, and then used falsified work orders to cover it up. I stared out over the ridge, the sun climbing slow and hot over my battered rows. "I'm not looking to destroy people," I said. "Just stop the damage." She paused. "Mr. Callahan, you're not the one doing the destroying." That night, something changed. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months came by, not all at once, but one by one, dropping off fresh bread, asking if I needed help tilling the rows, offering to bring by empty barrels to refill for the goats. Mrs. Halverson, the retired teacher 2 lots over, brought a photo of Ruthie from last spring when she used to let her grandkids feed her through the fence. "We never knew they cut off your water," she said softly, hands shaking. "I know," I replied. She wiped a tear. "We just thought you were going through something. They told us a lot of things." "They always do," I said. "But the truth has weight and it travels." 2 days later, I got a call from a local news station. They'd picked up the EPA bulletin and wanted an interview. I agreed and I told them everything. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with facts, documents, eyewitnesses. And the image that stuck with everyone wasn't the legal jargon or federal stamps. It was Ruthie, a goat who died because a board of suburban dictators decided her thirst didn't matter. The interview went viral online. Within 24 hours, local government issued a public statement. "We are reviewing the county's annexation process and the conduct of Clearview Meadows HOA leadership. We do not tolerate abuse of essential utilities. Accountability is coming." That was the word. Accountability, not vengeance, not punishment, just balance returning to a place where it had been ripped away. That weekend, a van showed up at the clubhouse. I watched from my porch as agents wheeled out file boxes, laptops, a desktop computer, several bags of shredded paper. Karen was nowhere in sight. Her Lexus was gone. But I wasn't looking for her anymore. I was looking at my land, and for the first time in weeks, it looked alive. I walked the rows, holding a fresh hose in my hand. Water flowed, the soil drank, the animals gathered, and I made a silent vow they would never go dry again. I heard she tried to resign twice before it all fell apart. The first time it was quiet, just a letter submitted to the remaining board members stamped, effective immediately, claiming health issues and unfair public targeting. But the board didn't accept it, not officially. They knew if Karen left, everything would land on their shoulders, so they begged her to stay. The second time, it was louder. I was walking through the hardware store restocking irrigation hose and fittings when I saw her. Karen Mitchell, former queen of Clearview Meadows, arguing with someone near the garden aisle. Hair disheveled, voice high-pitched and desperate. I said I already paid for that shipment. It was billed under maintenance, not private order. Check the goddamn code. The employee she was berating looked like he wanted to melt into the tile. I didn't say a word, just turned my cart around and left her there shouting to no one who cared anymore. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the cracks started to show. Marcus stopped by the farm that afternoon with an update. They've cut the landscaping budget in half, he said. Guess their accounts are frozen. I'm not even sure I'm getting paid for last month. I handed him a check for the help he'd given me. He tried to refuse, but I insisted. He'd done more than most neighbors ever would. She's unraveling, he said, pocketing the envelope. I heard she tried calling a private law firm, but they told her it's a conflict of interest now that the DOJ is involved. That night, I checked the HOA website out of curiosity. The once busy calendar of events, garden clubs, HOA brunches, dog yoga on the lawn had gone blank. Their message board was locked. No new updates. But the residents, they weren't staying silent. A local Facebook group called Clearview Residents for Reform had sprung up almost overnight. And the posts were brutal. Karen rerouted our money and lied about it. I checked my statement. We've been paying double for water since March. My lawn hasn't gotten pressure in a week, but the clubhouse had fountains going at night. James Callahan was right. We owe him more than an apology. I never commented, never liked or replied. I didn't need to. The truth was walking on its own now, and Karen was falling behind. By Friday, a formal HOA recall vote had been announced. Karen, along with 2 other board members, were facing removal. The election was scheduled for the following week earlier than usual due to what the board called community-wide crisis response. Translation: the pitchforks were coming. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but that didn't stop people from telling me what happened. Apparently, Karen tried to speak first. She brought out binders, charts, claimed the whole water situation was a misunderstanding exacerbated by incomplete zoning data. She called me a provocateur with an emotional agenda and said the HOA had only acted in the best interest of the majority. Then someone from the back of the room asked about Ruthie. They didn't shout. They just asked, and was it in the community's best interest to kill his goat? That was the moment. That's when Karen cracked. She didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She just froze. According to Marcus, who was there seated near the aisle, Karen stood at the podium, lips parted like she was going to say something else, but nothing came. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the lectern. And then, without another word, she sat down, lowered her head, and didn't speak again. The vote passed, 82% in favor of removal. Karen was out. The next morning, a for sale sign appeared in front of her home. I never saw her again, but I did receive a letter, a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a folded page typed in 11-point Times New Roman. Mr. Callahan, you may believe you won. That's fine. But people like me aren't the disease. We're the symptom. You'll see. No signature. I read it once, then again, then tossed it into the wood stove. Let her burn with it. I had no more space in my soul for venom. I was too busy rebuilding. The goats had started grazing again, cautiously but without panic. The tomato rows, replanted in fresh soil, were pushing green shoots through the ground like a soft defiance. I rebuilt the irrigation lines myself, installing a split pressure system with individual valves for each quadrant. So even if someone tried to sabotage one area again, the others would survive. And I wasn't alone anymore. The widow from down the street donated her old rain barrels. Marcus brought in gravel and helped me regrade the western slope. A teenager I barely knew volunteered to help repaint the fence. People were showing up, not because of pity, but because of principle. Clearview Meadows had forgotten what community meant. But my land remembered, my hands remembered, and so did the soil. And I wasn't just growing crops again. I was growing roots that couldn't be pulled up by fraud, power, or fear. Not anymore. The morning they delivered the shutdown order, the wind was warm and oddly still, like the air itself was holding its breath. I was walking the northern fence line, inspecting the fresh tomato trellises when I spotted the convoy. 3 black SUVs, one silver sedan with the state seal on its door, and a white, unmarked van with no plates. They moved slowly, deliberately as if rehearsed. I stood by the edge of my property, arms crossed, watching them roll past the front gates of Clearview Meadows. The HOA clubhouse doors were already wide open. The new interim board president, Sharon Davis, a retired real estate agent with a spine of iron, standing on the steps like she was waiting for Judgment Day. I didn't go over, didn't need to. I already knew what was inside that van: cease and desist papers, account freezes, probable cause affidavits, and the long, slow, bureaucratic sort of justice. It wasn't just about me anymore. Karen's private financial records had revealed more than anyone expected. She hadn't just redirected water. She'd been collecting vendor kickbacks, using inflated landscaping contracts to skim off the top, and charging residents emergency fees to cover costs that didn't exist. The entire HOA was rotting from the inside. And now, finally, someone had turned on the lights. From across the road, I saw one of the agents hand Sharon a thick envelope. Another rolled out a portable scanner and wheeled it into the clubhouse. I caught eyes with Marcus, who had stopped his truck at the corner. He gave me a nod, a silent confirmation of everything we had fought to expose. By noon, it was official. Clearview Meadows Homeowners Association was under federal receivership. The HOA bank accounts were frozen, all contracts suspended. A full audit launched under the supervision of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The clubhouse was locked and sealed by 3 p.m. By 4 o'clock, residents were walking the sidewalks with stunned expressions, clutching their phones, taking photos of the yellow notices pasted across the clubhouse doors. Some were confused, others angry, but a few looked relieved. That evening, I got a knock on my door. Sharon stood there with a basket of eggs and a bottle of homemade peach wine. "I figured you could use a proper thank you," she said. I invited her in. We sat on the porch listening to the goats shuffle in the barn and the sound of birds returning to the trees. "I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner," she said, eyes glassy. "Sorry we let it get this far." "You weren't meant to see it," I replied. "People like Karen, they build fences, not communities. That's how they win." Sharon looked out at the fields. Not anymore. She told me about the upcoming vote to dissolve the HOA altogether. With federal oversight, they were giving residents the option to convert the neighborhood into a cooperative land trust. Less power, more transparency. "People want peace now," she said. "They're tired." "So am I said, "but peace takes work." The next few days were a blur. Media vans parked along the edges of the subdivision. Drones from news outlets circled overhead. Every time I turned on the radio, there was another headline. Small-town HOA faces federal shutdown over water theft. Whistleblower veteran exposes HOA corruption. Clearview Meadows, a cautionary tale in power abuse. I gave one final interview to a national network. Just me, my porch, a microphone, and the truth. I told them about Ruthie, about the nights hauling barrels by hand, about watching people sip cold drinks on HOA lawns while my crops died behind locked valves. But I also told them about Sharon, about Marcus, about the people who showed up with rain barrels and bread and shovels. And I said the line that they ran in bold across the bottom of the screen. They cut off my water, but they couldn't stop the flow of justice. A week later, the vote passed. The HOA was dissolved. Karen Mitchell had vanished, rumored to have moved 2 counties over, living under her maiden name. She'd lawyered up, but the audit findings made prosecution likely. The last I heard, the DOJ was preparing formal charges. I never saw her again, but her legacy that stayed in the form of a lesson, one the whole town seemed ready to learn. I was asked to speak at the first community co-op meeting. I stood under a canvas awning in the same park they once watered with my stolen pressure lines. Now it was dry but proud, honest. I didn't prepare a speech. I just looked out at the people, The same ones who'd once crossed the street to avoid eye contact with the angry farmer and told them the truth. Freedom doesn't mean isolation, I said. It means responsibility to yourself, to your land, and to each other. The crowd clapped, not loud, but real. Afterward, a boy no older than 10 came up and handed me a sketch. It was a goat under a big, bright sun. She was my favorite, he said quietly. Ruthie. I didn't have words for that, only tears and gratitude. I took the drawing home and pinned it above the kitchen window. Every morning after that, when I turned on the tap and heard the flow of clean cold water, I thought of her and of the quiet war we fought. And when fall arrived with a softness I hadn't felt in years, the air changed not just in temperature, but in tone. It smelled different, like freshly turned soil instead of scorched bitterness. The trees along the property line turned to shades of amber and rust, their leaves drifting down like a gentle surrender. Life, it seemed, was returning, not just to the land, but to me. I had spent the summer replanting what was lost. Not everything came back, and not everything had to. I let the east field rest, seeding it with clover for next spring. The tomatoes, resilient as ever, bounced back with new roots in fresh soil. The goats were thriving again, their troughs brimming, coats glossy under the early morning sun. I adopted 2 more from the rescue shelter, named them Justice and Mercy. The names felt appropriate. The transformation of Clearview Meadows was equally remarkable. With the HOA formally dissolved, the residents voted to establish a neighborhood council with no enforcement powers, just shared responsibility. The bylaws were rewritten. Utility access was restored and regulated by the county, not private hands. The community park was officially reopened as Ruthie's Meadow, a gesture they insisted on after the story touched people far beyond our zip code. Sometimes I walk past it in the early morning hours and just sit. I watch kids play where sprinklers once ran on stolen pressure, where Karen once demanded silence and order. Now there's chalk art on the sidewalk, laughter, and even a few raised beds of herbs planted by the local Girl Scout troop. It's healing. Not perfect, but real. One Sunday, Sharon invited me to speak at the County Land Rights Symposium. I hesitated. Public speaking was never my strength, at least not outside a courtroom or a combat debrief. But she said people needed to hear it and maybe I needed to say it. So I stood on a stage in front of 200 property owners, planners, and legal advisors, and I told them what happened. From the first dry faucet to the last broken lock. From the buried pipe to the buried truth. From Ruthie's death to Karen's collapse. But I didn't end with outrage. I ended with ownership, not of land, but of story. Communities die in silence, I said, not just because of what is done to them, but because no one speaks when it happens. They gave me a standing ovation. I didn't expect that. Afterward, 3 different organizations approached me. One asking if I'd consider consulting for small-town utility compliance training. Another offering to publish my story in an agricultural rights journal, and a third from a nonprofit that defends homeowners against HOA abuse. I agreed to all 3, not for the money, for the impact, because I was done being quiet. And it turns out I wasn't alone. Marcus started a YouTube channel, the HOA Whisperer, he calls it, where he interviews people who've gone through similar power struggles. Sharon co-authored an op-ed in the local paper about the dangers of unchecked HOA authority and was elected to the county zoning board last month. Even the teenager who painted my new fence last spring, he's studying environmental law now. I've watched this quiet rebellion grow, rooted in soil that was once dry and dead. And I know deep in my chest that we didn't just win a battle. We planted a movement. One morning, I received a package. No return address, no note. Inside was a framed photo. It was a still shot from that town hall meeting the moment I stood with the USB in hand, the projector casting evidence behind me. Karen frozen in disbelief. Whoever took the photo captured something rare, a man who had nothing left to lose finally gaining ground. I hung it next to Ruthie's drawing above the kitchen sink. So I never forget. Not what they did, but what I did next. Now every time I turn on the faucet, I let it run for a second longer. Not because I need the water, but because I respect its return. It reminds me that peace is not the absence of noise. Peace is the sound of justice echoing quietly through the pipes long after the shouting has stopped. And for the first time in a long time, I am no longer just a man with a patch of land. I am a witness, a guardian, a farmer of more than crops. I grow truth now, and it grows back stronger every time they try to bury it. This is what they do. They use rules to control, to intimidate, to break you. But you can fight back. Your story is your weapon. And on this channel, we're going to unfilter all of them.